thrilled that you're supporting the library. I'm telling you, libraries need your support. It's very, very important that you show up to these things, because if you don't, pretty soon they'll start to disappear. Believe it or not, the museum in Bay City, Michigan, almost failed its millage by 200 votes. They almost closed it. So your vote is by coming here, showing up. When the millages come around too, that's how you vote, to show that we need these resources, and we really do, especially for the projects that I do. So let's get started and talk about the Fitzgerald. Can we maybe bring down the lights a little bit here? You don't need to see me, you can see this ship. What happened that we built the Edmund Fitzgerald, or why was it actually created? Well, the truth was it really wasn't a standard route for the ship to be built, in the fact that it was actually designed and built by a company for the Northwest Mutual Life Insurance Company. Now, it sounds like a stretch. You know, why would a life insurance company really care about building a freighter? But it really isn't a big stretch, because as you went into the mid-1950s, iron ore and coal transfers on the Great Lakes were big dollars. And Northwest Mutual bought into some old ships, and they were running 4 of those ships and doing very well with them. So when the Soo Locks were actually modified to allow a maximum size freighter at 700 feet long, they basically said, let's be the ones to build it. They were going to build what is essentially the largest object ever dropped into fresh water, and they were going to build it near Detroit at River Rouge with Great Lakes Engineering Works. So if you look at this policy, it's kind of interesting. Who's the president of Northwest Mutual? Edmund Fitzgerald. So it's not a big stretch to figure out where the name came from. The rumor goes that Edmund Fitzgerald did not want his name on the boat, that he fought the board of directors and said, I don't want to be on there, but when he went for a bathroom break, they voted it in. I don't know if that's true, but it makes for a fantastic story. It also, another story I heard from Elizabeth Cutler Fitzgerald, his daughter, is that he never heard Gordon Lightfoot's song. That's another thing to me that seems not possible. He died, I believe, in the early 80s. To think from 1976, when this became the #2 song in the nation, all the way up to them playing it every fall, I find it hard to believe that. But let's think about what a maximum size freighter was going to be. It was barely going to squeeze through the Soo Locks, 729 feet long. How big would that be? That actually would be big enough to put several different famous ships on its hull. Take a look at this. The Mayflower, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and the Ironclad Monitor could all fit on the deck of this massive freighter, 729 feet long. And this footage wasn't available until I made my documentary. I actually went to a library at the University of Michigan. As I always do, I go through the old card catalog. I found one that said GLEW, which I knew was Great Lakes Engineering Works, and it said 301 ship. That's Hull 301. And I'm like, oh, this has got to be the Fitzgerald. So I brought the movie up to the lady at the front desk. I said, can you transfer this to videotape for me? She goes, oh, yeah, what is it? I said, oh, it's nothing. It's nothing. So she calls me up at the TV station afterwards. She goes, you stinker. This is the Edmund Fitzgerald. And I told her, it's the only footage ever shown of the complete construction of the Fitzgerald. It was actually filmed by Willett Spooner, who was one of the engineers on board the actual creation of it. So literally from the hull, this is the keel being laid down in the first plates. This would be the ceremonial beginning of any ship. When they lay the keel down, they call it the keel laying. And there's the keel right through here. And there they are laying it down. This would be the backbone of the Edmund Fitzgerald. As this piece goes down, all the bigwigs come out. They're known by their white helmets. And they come out, get their pictures all taken. You can see 1957 was the year that they were going to build it. Again, the biggest ship that they were going to build here. After this, they built 2 more ships, the Homer and the Jackson. And there was a lot of talk about the Fitzgerald because the way they put this together was using a new type of weld that was very, very quickly done. And people thought maybe that's why the Fitzgerald sank, was because of this production weld. The truth is the Jackson is still sailing today. We see it come up the Saginaw River. It's still a very viable freighter on the Great Lakes. They turned it into a self-unloader, like a lot of people believe the Fitzgerald would have been converted. The Homer, though, was involved in a horrible collision on the river. And once it was in that collision, the bottom fell out of the market, and they basically decided to scrap it. Now, Fitzgerald Fitzgerald was actually launched a bunch of times, and that's because the Fitz was built in sections, and then the huge gantry crane actually picked up those pieces and moved them into the slip and launched them, and then they moved them over and put them into pieces like giant modules of a ship. So watch this. This is one of the early sections. This would be the cargo hold up here, and watch it splash in. And then the big gantry crane here, that's 65 feet tall, would pick up these massive sections of steel and put them together until they all lined up. And then the side of the ship would go up. So the slope that you see right there would actually be the slope of the inside of the ship, where the cargo, coal, iron ore, sometimes grain they would haul on freighters like these. But for the most part, it was iron ore that they were going to haul. Now let's take a nice shot of the skeg. This is where the propeller and the rudder, so the middle part there is where the propeller would go through. The rudder would be right there, a massive piece of steel, and you really don't get a scale to look at the people. It's massive, and it filled the entire slip there. Has anybody been down to the yacht club that's down by River Rouge, where it is now? That the Fitzgerald's launch basin is actually a yacht club now, so you can go through there. On one of the anniversaries, we went out there to actually go through the slip. And somebody gave me a giant rivet that they found down there. And the Fitz had a couple of rivets, but for the most part it was welded. I'm sure it wasn't from there, but there was so many ships that were built at Great Lakes Engineering Works for sure. Here's the hatch combing starting to come in. This is going to be significant because there's 22 of these hatch combings that the freighter would go underneath the ore docks, and these pockets are essentially open because they would take this massive train tracks on the deck, and a big crane would come across the top, and it would actually pick up those covers, and then the chutes would allow gravity to feed the iron ore inside. And I'll show you some of that in the footage there, but let me bring it to the next one here. Here's Edmund Fitzgerald taking a look at the ship, making sure everything was going okay. Now, if you look up here, whoop, let me go back. I'm going to show you this. This is the Homer's sister ship. Before I show you the Fitz going, look at how big that rudder is, and the giant propeller that's here. And this is a launch right after the Fitzgerald, and you'll see when it goes in, the place you don't want to stand is right where all those people are. That's because it's going to make a very large splash. You'll notice that it's largely red there. That's an anti-fouling paint. And then here's the engineers coming out to check it out. And then they have it up on these blocks, and they knock out the timbers, and then it slides down these greased ways, so it goes right into the water from here. And it's a big to-do. When the Fitzgerald went into the water, there was well over 10,000 people that showed up there. There's always been this rumor, well, because it was the largest thing ever launched, there was a rumor that there was a heart attack by somebody that was there. And I keep hearing stories of that, but I cannot find a newspaper report or a coroner's report for that yet. So I'm hoping to verify. It's a sad story, but I do want to know if it's actually true because it showed up in a couple of books, and I've heard other lecturers talk about it as well. Watch this splash. Think they're too close? Just amazing. Well, Fitzgerald didn't have a sister ship. There was nothing that was exactly like the Edmund Fitzgerald, but the Homer was about the closest that you would get to it. It looked very similar to it. When the Fitzgerald went in, there were guys that rowed the ship in, and this guy right here is Ed Demansky. And Ed is going to tell us exactly what that ride was like as he went down the ways and why he was on board there.
Our job was to go in with the boat was launched sideways. And as I've shown in some of the pictures, I'm the guy with the death grip on the stanchion when she went in. Because when that flat slab of a side hit the water, she keeled over to about a good 35-degree angle. So after it stopped bobbing around, I started asking her, what do we do now? I says, we're in the water, what do we do now? And the foreman says, well, now we go down into the double bottom, into the tanks down there, and listen for running water to see if a seam might have given way when it hit the far side of the slip. Well, I says, well, if I hear running water, you're going to hear running footsteps. That's me getting out of here. But no, we didn't have any problems at all. She was a well-built boat, and we never did get any water in the tanks.
You know, and I did mention to him, hey, what's the possibility that the Fitzgerald might have been built too fast? He said, you know what, Rick? He said, we knew, here's the Fitz going in, we knew that men would be on board this freighter. We knew that their lives depended on it. Here we go as we splash in. And notice the Fitz isn't fit out yet. A lot of the material is missing on the back and the front of the ship, the pilot house and everything. But it did have its engines, its motor inside of it. So the engine was in there, and the boilers too, which was rare for a launch. Normally that was done afterwards. But that's the big splash that it made as it went inside. Let me show you. Here it is squeezing through the Soo locks. I always get people at my talks come up to me and they say, I've got a picture of the Edmund Fitzgerald in the Soo locks, and would you like to, you know, buy it from me? It's in a safe at my house. And I said, you know, I appreciate, you know, that, but the Fitzgerald was one of the fastest ships. In fact, they called it Toledo Express for the speed that it made going from the Duluth or Minnesota, Silver Harbor, all the way down to Toledo with iron ore for making steel. It went through hundreds of times to the Soo locks. So there's a lot of footage. There's a lot of movies. I'm always surprised by people bringing movies to me, too. I found so much footage. I probably have the largest probably library of Fitzgerald footage, certainly of underwater footage. I know I do, too. But as they squeezed through here, it was barely going, making it through on each side. It was quite a squeeze to get inside there, for sure. Here's some footage of the Fitzgerald when she was light, and this is going to be significant. This is called freeboard, the distance between the water and the distance between the deck. Now, in the wintertime, they tried to limit how much cargo they held so it would sit real high. This is unloaded. That's why it's so high right now, and that's because the waves would come up. There's the hatch crane right there. That's because the waves would come up. But the Coast Guard at that time believed that the Fitzgerald's 22 hatches had a seal around them and 96 clamps on each one called Kessner clamps. They believed it was watertight. And from what everybody said after they were unloading, there was never water found inside the hold of the ships, and they believed that they were watertight. But the truth is, once they took a closer examination after the accident, that they did leak, that they had where they could actually go inside the Homer and the Jackson and look on the inside and see light coming through there. Water did come through those. Here's another interesting thing, too. This is a hawser on the front of the ship. It'll come back up again. I've only seen this on the Fitzgerald. It's a massive hawser where I believe tugboats could actually tow the ship. And I don't know why other freighters don't have that, except the fact that this was owned by an insurance company, and they wanted every safety feature they could possibly have on board. So that's what I believe why it had that interesting hawser on the front. This is what it was hauling. This is called taconite. By World War II, most of the iron ore, the high-quality iron ore, had been used up. And somebody came up with a process to take low-grade iron ore called taconite and break it up and actually sort it out so that the high-grade iron ore would go in and they could get rid of the waste rock that was there. And then they'd roll it into pellets, and the pellets were really great for loading because they would go into the train cars, spill out, and go into the gravity-fed loading docks. So that's what they look like magnified very many times. Today, I'm very humbled to hear that there's actual cargo from the Edmund Fitzgerald in the audience today. In fact, could you guys hold it up real quick? This is actual taconite from the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald that was given to them during one of the expeditions that happened. In 1989, they took a robot submarine down there, and also the Clelia went down there, and they accidentally scooped up some taconite and brought it up to the surface. Now, a lot of us are kind of like, well, wait a minute. We know that you're not allowed to take anything from the Edmund Fitzgerald, but the story goes from one of the guys that was on there, he told me, well, Rick, we brought it up, we had it, and we called the Canadian government and said, listen, we've got this illegal stuff. Can we throw it back? And they said, no, that would be polluting. So whether or not that's true, I don't know, but that is an amazing thing to have, and I'm so honored that you'd bring it. And it's brought by a former crew member of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So great to have you. Anybody else here with a personal connection to the Fitzgerald with a show of hands? Usually we see it. What was your connection, sir?
Third mate.
Third mate.
Share the same town in Iron River, Wisconsin.
Fantastic. Wow.
I'm exactly 1 year and 3 months older than Michael Armagus.
Yep.
My parents knew him quite well, and my father also did 20 years on the Oracles.
Unbelievable. It's an honor to have you in the audience. The Armagus family were actually, yes. The Armagus family actually came to the church before our expedition in 1994 during the blessing of the plaque that we were the first ones to mark the crew. and we got to talk with them just so briefly. But fantastic family and a terrifying loss for the family involved, that's for sure. Gordon Lightfoot was wrong. I'm going to tell you that right now. Many parts of his song are incorrect, and one of the main ones was when they left fully loaded for Cleveland. No. Now, we could stretch and we could say they were fully loaded for Cleveland because the company that was chartering the vessel, Oglebay Norton, was based in Cleveland, but that wasn't where she was making her final voyage. In fact, picked up cargo here in Superior, Wisconsin, and was going down to Zug Island. And Zug Island is within a mile or so of where the Fitzgerald was actually launched. And because she was coming down the Detroit River, she wasn't carrying as much cargo as she could. They would put 30,000 tons on board, but 26,000 long tons is what they had on board for the last journey. So they take off from here. It's a beautiful sunny Sunday. And the first mate has a job. He has to decide how many of those hatches he's going to dog down. He's going to order the deckhands to go out there, 96 clamps on 22 of those clamps, so do your math. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of overtime. And he decided not to put them all on. And I get people in the audience always that tell me there's no way that they did that. The truth is it happened all the time, and I'll prove it by the end of this lecture. Did that sink the ship? I don't think it sank the ship. Was it a factor? It certainly was a factor. And many of the accidents that we see, it's never one cause. It's a series of unfortunate decisions that were made. The biggest one being that Captain McSorley knew that a storm was coming when he left here. And by the time he made up by two harbors where the Arthur M. Anderson came in and started to head up to up the lake, he made the first bad decision. At Isle Royal, there were several freighters that were sitting there, including the Blau. It was 100 feet longer than the Edmund Fitzgerald. So they didn't want to go out into the storm. They decided to stay, drop their anchor, and hide behind here because over Oklahoma, a massive low front was coming in, and it was rushing to Marquette. The guess was, how long would it take to go from here to here? And McSorley was a very seasoned skipper. He was a heavy weather skipper. He didn't mind storms. In fact, when the Coast Guard did their investigation of the Edmund Fitzgerald, they looked at what ship had been through the Soo Locks during the worst storms over the last decade. And guess what ship it was and what captain? The Edmund Fitzgerald and Ernest McSorley. So he was used to big storms. He made a decision not to pass Keweenaw and go straight for Whitefish Point. He was going to take what they call the Scenic Route. They call it scenic because you can see more of Canada by going up here. Now, I don't think you really see that much, but he made a second mistake when he hit Otterhead and could have dropped a hook right up there and stopped where the waves would have been small. Now remember, if you're looking at waves on Lake Superior, let's see, here we go. Northwest winds coming down here, the waves up here would be small. Where would be the worst place you'd ever want to be on the Great Lakes during 70-mile-an-hour gales, pushing the waves higher and higher and higher? This is ground zero right here. So he gets up here, he could have stopped. But instead, he told the Anderson he's going to go for it, and they start going past Mr. Picotin. They start to go between Caribou and go in through here. And at this point in here, that's where the Anderson is tossing in the waves back and forth, and he looks at his radar, and he sees the Fitzgerald closer to Caribou. And he makes a comment to his crew member and says, wow, she's closer in there than I'd want to be. Here's the big storm coming in, and here's the low pressure system now coming over the UP. You can see the UP. Here's Keweenaw here, and the winds are starting to pick up. You can see the barometric pressure is dropping, allowing those winds to build. And here's where they tried to come through. As they came through here, he looked at this. Now, on the Canadian maps, this looks like a 6 in many cases. This one actually looks more like an 8, and that's a truer reading. So when they came through this, they call it 6 Fathom Shoal or Chummy Bank. As they came through here, that's where the Anderson thought that they hit bottom. He thought that if it's 30 feet of water, the ship is drawing that much, it goes up on a wave and hits its bottom. When the Coast Guard tried to reconstruct this course, it would have taken an extra half hour to get there. There's no way that they came close here. And the Canadian government actually came back out and surveyed all of this area around Caribou and found out it was deeper. I talked to actual crew members on board the Bayfield that were in here, and I said, what did you find? Nothing. They found nothing, but still we hear all kinds of rumors about divers who've been down there who saw red paint and all kinds of other silliness that has no factual basis at all. Here's the deck of the Fitzgerald. As they're going through the storm, they say to the Anderson, we've got some damage. And the damage was to the vents. See these mushroom caps that are here, here, and here? That's to equalize the pressure in the hold. And they're loosened or tightened up depending on how much air pressure they need to let out as the water goes in and out of there. So one of these or two of these were down. We don't know which one. He said he had a fence rail down too. Now, we don't know if it was on port or starboard. If he's riding with this side to the waves and it's a starboard side rail down, those waves now can build onto this deck. And remember, water's coming in through here, probably water's coming in through one of these vents, and it's going faster than his pumps can take out. So he starts to tell the Anderson, I'm going to check down. The Fitz was a fast ship. It could go 15 knots. So they started to check down and to allow the Anderson to close the distance between them. I think 9 miles is the closest that they got. And as they're going through there, again, people say, well, Rick, the Anderson must have been worried about the Fitzgerald if they thought it ran aground. The captain, Cooper, on the Anderson went to take a nap. He went down and laid down. So when people tell me, again, it hit bottom, I'm telling you it hit bottom, Cooper did not believe that. And there was a lot of things that happened after that that started to build the case for why it was a better idea if the ship ran aground. And I hope I'll convince you by the end of it. Now, where'd that damage come from? We don't know. Some people thought it was a stump that might have hit the vent. It could have been the propeller blades that were there because we don't know if they were still stowed on board at that time or not. It could have been damage from anything. Now, if it was the hatch crane coming off, I've heard from different divers. I never saw the hatch crane when I was down there, but I did hear it was in the middle debris field. It could have also caused that kind of damage as well. But here's each one of those hatches. Every one of those clamps on there, you can imagine what a job it would have been to make sure they were all buckled up. And it's bringing in water. Here's the Anderson before its crane was put on the deck. The Anderson's about 9 miles behind. Waves start to build, and they take a 30-foot wave that hits their lifeboat way up here. Damages the lifeboat. Cooper said there were 12-foot water on the decks. They call it green water because it's so thick you can actually see the color in it. Otherwise, it's just kind of a clear spray from Lake Superior. But once you get 4 to 7 feet on board, it's starting to be a problem. They thought a 12-foot wave came on board here. NTSB investigators believe a 4-foot wave on the Fitzgerald would collapse those hatches, the main hatches going in, and the Fitzgerald would go down if that happened. Here's the route that they came down, where the Anderson joined in, and they came down, and here's where the Fitzgerald wreckage was found. So they made it past here. Look at the time that it took to go from here to here, too. I think that if it really bottomed out, it would have sank in here rather than down here, too, if that was even a possibility. The captain, of course, on the Fitzgerald never said anything about hitting the bottom, never said anything about having any kind of a problem from that, just that a hatch rail was down. The first mate was the last one to talk to the Edmund Fitzgerald on board the Cooper on board the Anderson, and he said, how are you doing with your problems? And McSorley said, we're holding our own, and that's when they vanished. There was another transmission that was made before that was to some ships that were at Whitefish Bay. When they first started to look at Whitefish, they've got that big exoskeleton lighthouse that's there. The light had gone out, and the Fitz couldn't see the light, so he was trying to call the ships to say, hey, what's going on with our lighthouse there? And they heard, don't allow anybody on deck, was what McSorley had said off mic. So they know that something was going on board, and there was some wreckage on the underwater stuff that we found, a rope that was around the steering pole that looked like that's where people would have went on deck to put that rope around there. I don't know how else it would have been there. So that might have been part of what McSorley was saying during that. So Fitzgerald goes down. It's a massive snow squall comes in. Anderson's watching him from behind. They look out. They see a big snow squall, no lights on the Fitzgerald. They look at their radar. The radar gets blinded out, blob on the radar. And when it clears, the Fitzgerald's gone. And they start calling the Coast Guard and saying, Sue, we're Sioux Control, we don't see the Fitzgerald. And the Sioux is like saying, well, hey, there's a 16-foot fishing boat out there. Would you keep your eye out for it? They didn't believe that the Fitzgerald could go down. And half of the recordings that I've heard were basically of Cooper trying to convince the Coast Guard that the ship had gone down. And there's a couple of issues that were happening for the Coast Guard at that point. The first thing is there wasn't a ship available for them to go out and do a rescue. So as Cooper's going through with these 30-foot waves, he's busting through the waves and makes it to Whitefish Point, figures out that the Fitzgerald sank, and now the Coast Guard's trying to convince him to turn around and be the ship to go look for survivors after he thought his entire crew would be lost. So unfortunately, nobody would be found, but for those crew members, they knew that they were the only hope. I mean, realistically, there was no Gumby suits or survival suits on the Fitzgerald at that time in 1975. The lifeboats were inflatable. I don't think that they had a snowball's chance in getting through that, sadly. So should they have turned around? And quite frankly, there were 3 saltwater vessels there too, and the Coast Guard asked them, would you turn around? And they said no. And before anybody says, oh, they should have, their responsibility is with the crew. That's their responsibility, is to keep themselves alive. I was on the sheriff dive team in Saginaw for 5 years. The first thing you do is protect your own safety. Otherwise, more people will drown. So you've got to make sure your safety's first to go. Was it good they went? Absolutely. The highest tradition was to try to save those, comrades of the sea to get out there and help them, and they were the only help. But here's some of the radio broadcast from my documentary that I have back there on the Edmund Fitzgerald. This is the first documentary to actually share the radio transmissions that were found, and it'll kind of explain to you what the mindset for Cooper was when they actually asked him to go back. The Coast Guard didn't have a cutter anywhere near Whitefish Bay, with the nearest being 24 hours away in Duluth. The Mackinac and Sundew were in repair status for the upcoming ice season, and the Naugatuck suffered an oil line failure and was unable to leave until that next morning. The Coast Guard made a desperate plea to the Anderson to turn around and go back into the storm.
This is typical, Roger, we have it. Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over. Oh, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way.
They were making, normally, 12 knots would be a good speed for a freighter. Can you imagine 2 or 3 knots busting through 30-foot seas in 70-mile-an-hour winds, and it took them hours to get back out there. The William Clay Ford also turned around and went looking as well, but didn't get out there till 1 o'clock. Coast Guard had different airplanes, different aircraft out there, but they couldn't land to save, grab somebody, even if they found somebody. So there were people on the scene right away, but they weren't finding anything. The Fitzgerald went down and just plunged in seconds and was vanished. I mean, literally gone. They found a couple spray bottles. They found some damaged lifeboats, which are pretty amazing. I'll show you a picture of those in a second. And they also launched a Coast Guard cutter from Duluth, the Wood Rush, to go out there and help. And the Wood Rush is designed to go through these heavy seas. It's actually designed to be on the ocean. And the captain that was there, his name is Jimmy Hobaugh. And what a hero this guy was, going 24 hours through that storm to try to pick up any survivors. This is an interview I did with Jimmy before he passed away.
About 23 hours to get here. The thing that people can't visualize. A lot of people have gone to sea in the oceans. These lakes are just, riding in these lakes are totally different. That night, when we got there, even though it was 24 hours later, number one, the storms up here last at least 3 days. That one lasted about 4. I've been in the ocean in North Atlantic storms, and yeah, it's rough. But the period between the swells is long. In the Pacific, it's even longer. Up here in the lakes, it just hammers you. Up here also, that night, for instance, when we got here, the seas were coming down from the northwest, hitting the Canadian shore and ricocheting off. They're hitting the U.S. shore and ricocheting off. So you got 3 seas coming at you from 3 different directions, and remember that the well deck on a buoy tender is relatively low, even though we had the shutters in. We were taking green water right over the bow, right over the sides of the ship, and of course the freeing ports are big enough that it would free itself. But I mean, the point is, there's no way that you could turn the ship where you were riding this way. You were either, normally in the ocean you can either pitch or roll. Out there, you pitched and rolled at the same time, and she would just snap on them. And they're constant, and they're very short period between seas. It was a weird, eerie time, and you don't sleep. And we were out there for 4 nights and 3 full days. We came in on the 4th day. We came in to the Sioux, but people just needed to lay down and sleep.
It's pretty amazing. You think 70 mile an hour winds. That's actually a Lake Superior storm every year. I mean, we get that even in the summertime on Lake Superior. I went out to Standard Rock Lighthouse, where there was a massive explosion in the 50s. I actually found the guy that survived the storm, the explosion, and I went out to the lighthouse to work with some guys that were putting some weather equipment out there, and they walk out and they said, "Well, that's not good." And I went, "What?" And 30 feet off the water is the deck of the lighthouse, and all of their gear had been stolen by Lake Superior, just taken. I said, "I've got my scuba gear." He goes, "Nah, we're at college. We'll just get some more." Thanks, dude. Let's see. Here's one of the lifeboats, and this is really hard for me to understand. Cut right in half. Now, we've seen them drug below and crushed. There's some flotation in there. It would kind of make sense. But the only thing that makes sense to me, and again, as I stand up here, I am a television journalist, a documentary reporter. I have no clue about metallurgy. I've never sailed the Great Lakes as a sailor. I can't stand up here and tell you exactly what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald, because I don't know that even an expert could. I can just tell you what I know and what I've seen. And this looks like a propeller cut it in half, is what it looks like. And when we looked at the damage on the propeller, we saw a lot of things. A crane, the steward's crane, which is where the cook would load groceries on board the Fitzgerald in the back of the ship, was wrapped around the propeller. There was ropes around the propeller. That was a violent time when it went down and flipped over and crashed down into the bottom. Here's lifeboat number 2 with a split right down the bow of the ship. And, of course, no one was found on the lifeboats or the 2 inflatables. Those 2 lifeboats are at the Valley Camp Museum in the Sioux. I highly recommend you to go see them. The inflatable is now at the National Museum of the Great Lakes in Toledo, which I'm going to be talking, I think, next month. So look for a big, they call it Wreckapalooza, that's going on down there. And I'll be talking about, I think I'm talking about the Griffin, which is another one of those amazing mysteries on the Great Lakes. Here's some of the oil. Here's Gordo. Couple things about Gordo. It turns out that in Detroit, when the bell started to ring in Mariners Church, when Father Ingalls ran down there and just started to ring it 29 times for all the guys, that some journalists had heard the bell tolling, and they thought, what's this all about? And it spurred them to know that there's, something that had happened on the Great Lakes. And every newspaper took the story, and mostly because, in 1975, this modern 700-foot freighter vanished. And even bigger was the fact that not one crew member, body or alive, was found after this. In 1958, when the Bradley went down, the largest freighter on Lake Michigan, they found most of the crew. There were 2 survivors. In 1966, when the largest vessel lost on Lake Huron, the Morel went down. It split into 2. The stern section kept sailing for 5 more miles, and not one guy got off of that stern. But on the bow, Dennis Hale survived, and he survived in just a pea coat, a life jacket, and his underwear. It was a miracle for 2 nights in November that he survived on that. But they found most of the crew. So why was it on the Fitzgerald? Why was it so sudden that it happened? But that's why Newsweek made a huge article about it. Most of the time, they probably wouldn't have done anything. And in Newsweek in Toronto, Gordon Lightfoot read it and started to write his song. I know that he read a book by Havinghurst called Long Ships Passing. Has anybody read that book? You're at a library. You've got to go look it up and go to the Michigan section or go to the local section. And Long Ships Passing talks about the Ojibwe legend of Lake Superior not giving up its dead. It has to be what inspired Gordon's lyrics, because there's at least 3 or 4 concepts from that book that I believe went into there. There's a couple things wrong with his song. We talked about the destination. The old cook came on deck and said, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya." The old cook was not on board the Edmund Fitzgerald when it went down. The old cook had ulcers, and the other cook, Red Bergner, who I knew, had a bone spur in his foot, and he lived in Nacogdoches, Texas. They called him up and they said, "Red, you got to come back for one more run." And Red said, "I'm not coming back. My foot hurts. I'm taking it off. I'm not going." And they go, "Come on, Bishop's got ulcers." And he says, "He's going to have ulcers whether he's here or not. Let him go." Well, neither of them went. So another cook called Rafferty went out there. Bob Rafferty went on board. He knew nobody on the Edmund Fitzgerald. He wasn't part of the crew. He never said, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya," because he didn't know them. I mean, he knew them for what? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that was about it. So, again, great song. Thank you, Gordon. I wouldn't be talking to you about shipwrecks if it wasn't for Gordon, but there are so many inconsistencies, and the reason I pick on him is because he changed his song, and I was so mad about it, but I'm getting ahead of myself now, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Three Sisters. Some people believe that there were 3 massive waves that picked up this freighter. Remember, 700 feet long, 3 big waves would cause these long ships to break. And yes, these are longer ships. They're designed to fit underneath our gravity-fed ore docks. There's no other ships like that in the world. They were designed just for the Great Lakes, but the design stunk. It was too long, and it could break in half. And it had happened with ships that had more brittle steel, like the Bradley and the Morel. For the Fitz, though, it wasn't the case. And there was a ship right behind the Fitzgerald that didn't sink from the Three Sisters. Remember, the Cooper on the Anderson went through it, so I don't put much merit into that at all. Now, there is some rules about ships sinking and how much they can claim, and ever since the Bradley went down in '58, the lawsuits started to get really, really intense to the $1 million mark. $8 million was the original lawsuit. Before, they could only sue for the cost of the ship and the cargo. So some of the settlements, if you look at this one, the widows were saying we're going to sue. Well, that's because basically the shipping company said we've got $817,000 we want to limit it to, which is ridiculous. I mean, that wouldn't be any kind of a condolence to any of those men that were lost. And it was obviously settled for more than that. But that's what the shipping company wanted to do. Here's the investigators that started looking into the Fitzgerald. Some of them had metallurgy experience. Captain Wilson was actually a ship captain, and they had just different experience that was there. And they started to look into the wreck. This is our metallurgist and one of the guys that knew about the leaking, and he did some computer models early in 1975 that said that it would probably sink in a half hour if just the hatch covers were leaking with a 1/16 of an inch of gap in there. So the numbers that were coming out were starting to really kind of make sense. Now, how did they get a look at the Fitzgerald? They went over with a submarine finding aircraft, and they found 2 giant blobs on the bottom, and none of them were 700 feet long. So they knew the Fitzgerald had to be in 2 different pieces. So they called up this robot called the Curve 3, and it was pretty famous in a tragic accident where a B-52 actually collided with a tanker and went down with a nuclear bomb into the ocean, and this little guy went down and found the bomb. So it was pretty famous, and they brought it up and basically tried to get it down to the ship. Now, in 1975, they had black and white TV. It was horrible pictures that came out of there, and they didn't really get a lot of good detail in it. And I've got to be honest, the pictures that they actually came up with were pretty bad. This is the quality of pictures they saw, where you can see a rivet and some of the torn steel in there. And this is where they tried to piece together what happened. So many of the drawings that we saw out of there were inaccurate, including this one where they're actually showing this right side up. But it is an interesting layout of how the ship, this is on course for 135 true going to Whitefish Bay. This thing is off and it's upside down, almost, completely at a different angle than the ship. How did that happen? And we still honestly don't know why it's in two pieces that way and why the stern section's upside down. There's some people that tell me that when they looked at airplane crashes, the tail would flip over. I don't know that that's true. I do know that for this, the propulsion was in the stern, and that would have probably flipped the ship over, and that's why we kind of had that kind of a, would steer off, because it obviously had no kind of water dynamics or aerodynamics anymore. It would have pushed to the waves and went around, and that's probably why it's facing the other way. Here's the Bayfield. This is the ship that went out and did surveys around Caribou and determined that the water was actually deeper than they actually thought. Again, no one really believes that it went close to there, but the headlines started to come out. Here's Red Bergner, our cook, who actually survived. Sadly, about probably 15, 20 years ago, he was killed in a car crash. So the interviews that we did and the time that we spent, this is actually at Port Huron. He baked me a lovely pie, which was very tasty. But Red was a good man, and we're very sorry that we didn't get more time with him for sure. They talked to a lot of the former crew members on board the Fitzgerald, and they wanted to know, what was the ship like? And some of the common themes that were coming out was the fact that the Fitzgerald flexed a lot. Even in moderate seas, it would just writhe like a snake. If you took a rug and kind of flipped it up, that's what the Fitzgerald would do. Now, every ship does that. That's kind of the design. As they go through the waves, they kind of flex out and go that way. But when they really go crazy, that's some concern. And Dick Orgel, who was a relief mate on board the Fitzgerald, really worried about that. And he actually told Captain McSorley that he was worried about it.
We're going to take the Scenic Route. And he said, we may have to change speed or alter course or something to relieve the strain on the hull. Usually the captain does that himself, But, so we talked about that a little bit, because I said to him, I'm not sure when I should do that, see? He said, well, I'm just going to be laying on top of the bunk. He should call me. And but we'd go into, and I told us at the bearing, and slamming into like a 10-foot wave. Now that's not so much of a wave, And you could then you could look aft from over the chart table and see that just go down the deck. It was like if you had a runner, like a rug, and you would flip it. It's similar to that. But it did it so much. I said to him, that couldn't cause, of course, after I said it, I realized that, that it wasn't a good question. But I said, that couldn't pop off them clamps, No. He said, I never heard of that. So anyway, I said, boy, she does bend a lot for a 10-foot sea. And he was going to his room, and he said, sometimes it scares me. But he never said anything more. He didn't carry on a conversation, just one-liners like that, see? I thought, that sounds funny to him say that, see? I've had people say, well, were you afraid on her? And I said, no, I wasn't. Because it never dawned on me that a ship of this quality and characteristics could break in two. Come on, Although I thought what is going to happen sometime is they're going to get into a bad storm and they're going to have a lot of damage to internal structural members that get twisted and bent. That's what's going to, that would be the worst thing that would happen. I never dreamed that she would actually break in two.
Pretty weird, him saying, it scares me sometimes. Here's the report on the sinking is inconclusive. So the Coast Guard came out and said, listen, we don't know exactly what happened. We can't figure it out, but we believe the hatch clamps played a role in that. And the NTSB came out and they looked at the hatches too. And here's some of the drawings that were done. And the artist told me that he just didn't have enough information. And that's why, this is all collapsed in here. This is all completely wrong. All on the top there, all of the antennas are still up there. He said that he just thought that there was nothing there. The report said that the bell was missing, and we know it wasn't missing. They went back and got it. So a lot of the details were that way. But look at the hatches. As you look here, they did get something very, very right, and that is this hatch here, 1 and 2, are collapsed inside, and then some of them are missing, and this one is actually sticking up here. So we found some off of the wreckage all twisted up. That's when the air pressure blew them out, and the hatch clamps hung on to what it could, and then it crumpled the hatch as it came up. And any of the hatch clamps that were dogged down were sheared off because they won't bend. They just shear completely off. And any of the ones that weren't dogged down, that were just laying there, would just be laying there undamaged. And guess what I saw when we dove it was a lot of hatch clamps that had no damage. So you can see really clearly there with some of the, this is another interesting thing on the Fitz. This is actually the ground level right here. And then there's this 25 or 30 foot drop right here. So it's buried into the bottom, what appears to be a hill or dug in. And then the bow section here hit with such force, it bent the entire bow section over almost 90 degrees. And here, this is torn away, the spar deck is torn away from the hull of the ship by almost 10 feet. So when it hit, 26,000 tons of iron ore came forward and split the sides completely off of the ship. That's how much momentum was coming down as it went down. And as we look at the, let me go over here and show you the hatch clamps real quick. Here's some footage I took. This is not sheared off. That's a hatch clamp that's was not dogged down. That one was not dogged down. That one was not dogged down. And this is the coaming, a 4-foot piece of metal that comes off the bottom of the ship, the spar deck, and then the cargo would go in through here. So the lid is gone. They believe those gaskets were totally ineffective. And of course, once the Coast Guard saw this, they said, well, first of all, we allow these ships to carry so much iron ore in the wintertime, no more. We're going to change it so you can't carry that much iron ore, and that way you'll ride higher in the waves and you won't be so susceptible to these November storms. The shipping companies all went, what? This is going to be billions of dollars that they would miss out on in cargo right before the lakes freeze up. The second thing they said, and watch as we go over here, this is going to shake. There's hatch clamps right there. All of them are undamaged. Those were not dogged down. And the ones that were sheared completely off, I think I might have a picture in a second here. As we went around the corner, one of our submarines right before me actually dropped down and didn't know where they were, and they went into the cargo hold, and all of a sudden they're inside, and it's not like you can get out of there real easily, unfortunately. Wilson, the interview that I did, talks a little bit more about the hatch clamps and what they saw. He really, he believed that it was because of that gasket and the ineffectiveness of the sealing that did cause some stuff. Once they started talking about the Fitzgerald's loading lines going up too, the other thing the Coast Guard said was the Fitzgerald had 2 screen bulkheads where water could go from fore and aft of the ship uncontrolled. Remember in the Titanic where the big doors came up to stop it from flooding? Not on the Fitzgerald. It could go anywhere it wanted, and then they had the rose box at the bottom where the pumps would have to pump it out, but it would have to filter through 26,000 tons of taconite pellets before it could be pumped out. It was a horrible design, and they said, well, let's make sure we get all the water subdivisions on the freighters fixed so they're all watertight. So now they're talking about less cargo in the winter, and definitely you're going to be modifying all of your ships to the tune of billions of dollars. And the shipping company said, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not into that. We heard you talk about things that sank on the Fitzgerald and what happened. We reject your theory of it going the hatch clamps and all of those modifications, and we say it ran aground. I think this is criminal. I think honestly that this was an easy way to say the captain screwed up. We don't need to make any modifications. Let's call it good. And that's where this whole thing came up on hitting the shoal, got really popular. And I'll be honest with you, for a lot of the museums who dealt with a lot of the family members, the one thing they didn't want to come in and tell them was, oh, by the way, because your son didn't put down the hatch, the ship sank. So they all started to embrace the same theory. And it just infuriates me in the fact that there's no fact to set that up except for Cooper looking over and saying, wow, she's closer in there than I thought. And this became this incredible theory of it sinking. There were also recordings of Cooper afterwards that said, basically, what do you want me to say during these investigations? We know that he was being coached on what he was supposed to talk about. And it's sad to say because the guy is a superhero in my eyes. But the truth is, he is the mouthpiece of the company. None of those captains are going to go against their shipping company to do that. And that's why a lot of this theory came out. I saw the entire bottom of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the last 250 feet of it. There's not a scratch on it. It never hit the bottom and scratched the front and then didn't hit the back. It just doesn't make sense. And all the other things that add up have nothing to do with that. So you can probably tell, and then the fact that the first 2 hatches are collapsed in, that ship, that big wave that hit the Anderson, 30 feet high, it raced ahead of the Anderson because it was doing about 40 knots. Remember, the Anderson was only doing 12, maybe with a tailwind, and it raced forward and hit the Fitzgerald at 7:15. In seconds, it nosedived into the wave, and that wave pushed down. It blew out all of the back windows. You can see it in the damage of the observation. It also crushed those two hatches right there, pushed its nose underneath, and she never recovered. So it just kept diving from the bottom and split apart before it hit. There's other people that say, well, it's 700 feet long, the water's 500 feet. It must have been sticking up like Titanic. No, it's not possible in my eyes. Again, I'm not a super trained guy in wrecks and stuff like that, but the truth is the stern section, when you see the underwater footage, is sitting on a pile of taconite. It wouldn't have broken like that and rained down and then just fell on top of it. It skidded across all of that taconite that had been falling in the water column. So I believe that it did go down in one piece and broke apart mid-column and skidded off. That's the only thing that makes sense to the damage that I saw that was down there. And 1980, Jacques Cousteau stopped by Detroit. He came by with Calypso. Coleman Young came on board. They got pictures together, and then Jacques took off. So he wasn't involved in the dives to the Fitzgerald, and part of that was because he had to go back to France. There's two ships that were found in Lake Ontario called the Hamilton and the Scourge. They're amazing War of 1812 vessels with bowsprits and cannons on board. He lost 2 divers during that dive when the Calypso came. They kept it pretty hush-hush because they didn't want, people to believe that the infallible Cousteau could have such an accident, but it was tragic, and he did lose 2, and I think that's why he left so early. But he put the investigation into the hands of his son, Jean-Michel Cousteau, who was in charge of the dives. They only had one dive, and it was only for a couple of minutes. They were doing an entire documentary on the Seaway and how it goes up into the St. Lawrence. When I called the Cousteau Society and I said, listen, I'm making a documentary. I just want a couple pictures of the soucoupe. And they said, no. And I said, well, come on, just a little bit of footage. I mean, no. And I said, well, I can get some footage. He said, good luck. And I said, okay. And I'm an investigative reporter, right? So I start looking around and I find out that the soucoupe was actually brought in by Westinghouse Corporation and torn apart for the technology, and they had all kinds of movies of it. So when I finished my documentary, I sent a lovely copy of it to Cousteau and gave them a very special salute to thanks for all your help. But was it a big deal to them? It really wasn't. Here's what Jean-Michel said when I asked him, this is the most famous Great Lakes shipwreck. What do you think about it? And here's what he had to say about that.
Something happens at home, it becomes a dear subject to people at home. The Fitzgerald means nothing to people in Europe or in other countries. When the Exxon Valdez went aground, it became a big issue in the United States. Why? Because it happened in the United States. It wasn't the biggest oil spill by any means, but it happened in the U.S., so the U.S. was certainly very much involved and aware of what was going on. Had that particular kind of accident taken place somewhere else, U.S. would have mentioned it as a small little line in the newspaper, and it would have gone unnoticed. So it's really a matter of where it happens and who's there at the time. There are ships sinking all over the world all the time. We never talk about it. But that particular one was right there and was the pride of the fleet, and a lot of mystery because no calls were recorded and everybody was lost. So it became a big deal.
It was the big deal, for sure. Literally, he mentioned it was the pride of the fleet, and I should bring that up because we're near Detroit. And the fact is that the Fitzgerald was the biggest ship of really Columbia's fleet at the time. And if you were owner of a steel company like National Steel and you wanted to keep that contract, you would let them go on cruises. And so they would go on board the Fitzgerald, and the best cook in the fleet would be on board to make incredible meals, steaks and lobsters and stuff. The ship was appointed, one of the very few was actually completely outfitted with furniture from Hudson's. So right downtown Detroit, they had beautiful furniture that they normally wouldn't have on board ships. The only problem is the deck of the Fitzgerald is canted, it's round, so they had to cut the legs on all of the beds and stuff, otherwise they wouldn't fit right. So it was all fitted together in a unique way to make it stay that way. There's always been a rumor, too, that Edmund Fitzgerald had a painting commissioned for the ship when it was launched. And it was going to be the ship of the Columbia, which was the very famous little schooner. In fact, it was the first to go through the Soo Locks with iron ore. It was also the first to bring a train car or a locomotive to Marquette. And it was a pretty cool ship. But the weird thing is that it sank. It sank in a very eerie place on Lake Michigan called Death's Door. So they had a picture of a shipwreck on board, the Edmund Fitzgerald when it went down. And the question was it still there? And a lady came to one of my talks near Lansing, and she said, if you can tell me the name of the second captain on the Edmund Fitzgerald, I'll give you a surprise. I said, well, it was Larson. Okay. And she goes, that was my uncle. And she handed me all of his movies on board. And here's video of that. You'll see it in the movie. You'll see the footage of, in this stateroom, the Columbia with a plaque that says, commissioned by Edmund Fitzgerald. So I believe it's still down there. I don't know any talk of that it was taken out. It probably is still hanging on the wall where we were not allowed to put anything into the windows, anything that would allow us to go inside, and that was to prevent us from seeing bodies. And I was totally good with that. I'm like, that's not why I got into shipwrecks. I enjoy the stories, the people who built the ship. In many cases, the amazing survivals are what makes me just in awe of the lakes. And the rescuers, the men and the women who put their lives on the line, that's the stories that I look for. Sadly, with the Fitzgerald, we didn't have that. If anybody's read Fred Stonehouse's book on the Fitzgerald, it's amazing. This is Fred. This is at the 1989. They took a stereoscopic robot down there and actually did 3D movies of the Fitzgerald. They hoped that maybe the 3D movies would make so we could actually investigate it a little bit better and figure out what happened. And the truth was, we really didn't find out much more except for this. This is the port side door on the pilot house of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it's open. Nothing had been in the Coast Guard report that had happened. And the question is, why was it open? This would have been the lee side of the ship, meaning out of the storm. So it's totally possible as they're going down past Otterhead and going past Michipicoten and Caribou that it was too hot in the pilot house. Many times they've got this boiler system that runs through radiators, and it's hotter than heck in these ships. I've taken a couple of freighter voyages in November, and honestly, there's no set it at 71 and be good. It's either really hot or really cold. And they vent it usually by opening up a door that's not affected by the wind. So that's one way to do it. It could have also, though, been a chance for someone to try to escape. They could have tried to get out of the pilot house when the vessel took the wave and went out. Whether or not that's true, we don't know, but it was a significant find. In 1994, this was the Clelia that went down. My rival TV station in Flint had a camera guy that sat in that giant dome right there. What a view that he had going down there. And they basically did a good survey, but the best thing for us is they left a mooring right on the wreck. So when we showed up a month later in our Delta, I'll show you the inside of the submarine we took. Here's Rick circa 1994 with my cool 80s glasses. And a mullet, too. That kind of rocks. The Delta was famous for diving with Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic. The Delta was used on his expedition of Lusitania. It actually got stuck on the Lusitania and had to drop its tail. So it's like a salamander. It can actually, as a safety feature, drop its propeller. This is Dave Slater, his dad, who invented the Delta submarine. We dove on the Carl Bradley in 1995. His dad actually was stuck in one of those submarines at 200 feet and had to flood the submarine. The pilot drowned, and he swam up with the world's record for a free ascent from a sunken submarine. Here's what we saw when we went on the bow. This is a blanket hanging out the window. This is when it gets sobering. When you go by the name Edmund Fitzgerald and it's this tall, and then you start to see things that are human, that are blankets, and I saw screwdrivers. I saw a cup on the bottom in the debris field that had the Columbia star on it, and everything inside me said, Rick, it's not on the wreck. It's off there. It could be from another shipwreck, even though it's exactly the same ship line in a modern cup. I wanted to grab it. After every time we go out, we do a debriefing, and of course, I didn't take anything from the Fitzgerald. That was our creed, was we would leave everything there, only take pictures. After my dive, there was actually some battery power left over, and as we go to dive in here, he's going in with a plaque to leave a plaque, and I'm actually on deck putting my scuba gear on because my job was to jump into the water and film the submarine going down. I thought there'd be a backup diver. Normally we do this with all kinds of divers. I didn't have a backup diver. I get there and I'm go, okay, so where's my backup diver? They're like, oh, it's you. I go, okay, not a good plan, but I was a sheriff diver. We dive by ourselves in zero visibility in the river. There's the plaque with the names of the guys. This is well before the bell came off. It also has the name of our crew, so my name is down on the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald with the rest of the crew that dove it. Here's me in the water taking pictures of the plaque going down. But during the dive right after mine, the owner of the tugboat that we were leasing said, hey, I'll give you a break if you let me and my boy go down and take a look. And we thought, well, what could that hurt? Let's go ahead and do that. So he dives down, and we go to get a sandwich, and all of a sudden we get a report that they found a body. And we were blown away because the people from the Coast Guard never saw a body. Jacques Cousteau, never. 2 different visits by Whitefish Point, never found one. And we could not believe it. Off of the bow near that open door was a man on the bottom in coveralls in a life jacket. Now, that was extremely significant in the fact that he had a life jacket on. Why didn't it float? Did he get out when it was too deep and the compression of the water squeezed that cork in that life jacket so he couldn't float? We didn't know, but the sub went around the body and took all kinds of pictures. It's in Canadian water, so we brought all of those movies to the Canadian government as part of our license and gave them the footage. And then it became my job was, how do I tell this story? We knew when we got back to the dock, every journalist you could think of, there were more headlines that came out from this thing than anything else. I mean, maybe the sinking was a little bit worse, but the truth is they weren't very flattering either. When they thought we were going to use the footage, they started calling us pirates and saying, oh my God, these people are ghouls. The truth is that every museum has done stuff with shipwrecks, and even King Tut, they put him under glass and they carry him around, but this was a modern shipwreck. And there were modern families that were saying, this is not right. So what were we going to do? Well, I decided if I didn't put something in there, people would call us a liar. They'd say, you never found that. So I said, I'll use one shot, but I used it after the submarine went around the victim and came back and put a halo of silt around. So all you saw was a bump. And we never used any close-ups. They were never released. They were never sold. National Geographic, Nat Geo and the Inquirer wanted the footage, and we never sold it. We also put a song together called It's Quiet Where They Sleep, which I felt was the requiem for those men that had never had a funeral. And we felt we did a really good job, but the government here in Michigan immediately said, no, it's banned. You can't film it. You can't do anything with it. And we weren't about to fight it. So 300 copies of that video were made, and that was it. My documentary does not have anything in there. I don't have the control of that. I only saw the footage once when I was going through it to decide what shot we were going to do. And people always ask, could you identify who it was? And out of respect for the relatives that were there, we know he was probably from the forward end crew. We never described it. So other than the life jacket and the coveralls, that's all we've really said about it. We never showed the face. Obviously, we have a lot more couth. This is the law that came out. I actually called the government in Lansing and said, hey, I wrote, produced, and I'm editing this piece together. Do you think I can come and talk to you and tell you why we're doing it? No. I said, no. I said, yeah, we've already made up our minds. We've already passed the law, and it's done. So I was very upset about that. As we talk about hatch clamps, I went to a fishing trip with my dad up in Canada, came back through the Sioux Locks, and this Bay City-built ship was going through the Kinsman Independent. And as I came through, I looked at the hatches, and I thought, well, they must all be dogged down, because after the Fitzgerald went down, who would ever go out into a storm without them dogged down? On, off, on, off. See, it still happens. And if you get the new book from the Edmund Fitzgerald, Chris Winters just put out with Bruce Lynn from the museum up at Whitefish, which is, how many people have been to Whitefish Point? For those hands that didn't go up, make me a promise, first of all, to go to my beloved UP, where I was born and raised, and spend your money up there, but see the incredible museum that's there. I'm biased because I'm on their board of directors, but the museum is fantastic, and the way that they put together the stories is incredible. But you look through that book that they just put together, and every picture of the Edmund Fitzgerald has hatch clamps that are not dogged. And all that footage I got from Larson, too, had birds sitting on clamped clamps on it too. So it happened quite regularly. This is what happened in July of 1995. Might be a little loud with the belt was cut off by an underwater diver. I'll show you a picture of the nude suit. National Geographic was filming. When it came down, it actually rang when it hit the ground. There's the nude suit. That's Bruce Fiocco. He had a welding torch on his arm, and he could cut it loose. And see how it's gray and pitted? They sent this to Michigan State University, and they cleaned it up, and then they repainted it. I'll wait for the This guy wrote a book on the Fitzgerald, McGinnis, Emery Christoph, and the other guy on the right was the diver, Bruce.
Bless them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Champlain, the brother of one of the engineers. Now, when the Fitzgerald Bell came up, it was property of Canada. They gave it to our Secretary of State and said, "Here, this is, belongs to the state of Michigan." And the Secretary of State put it on loan at Whitefish Point. Well, they brought it to Michigan State. They cleaned it all up. They repainted it with the gray paint. And the guys at the museum said, it doesn't look like a showroom piece. We've got to buff it out. So they polished it. And the people at MSU were so ticked off because it wasn't, legit. In honesty, I mean, yes, it's the showpiece of the museum. And I think people have an expectation. But, there's so many things in these shipwreck stories. When I watch these documentaries on Discovery, and I've been on 2 of them, people blow a lot of this stuff up, and I wonder why. These stories are so fantastic to begin with. We don't need to amplify that or to change it, and I wish it would have stayed the same. I'm going to close by showing you the Wood Rush, the cutter, the 180-foot buoy tender, is still in service in the African Navy. Believe it or not. It's called the Shark now, so I guess this would be Baby Shark. If you know the song. I've got 2 grandbabies, and one that's all she sings to us right now. It's Hannah's favorite song. I thought that Jimmy Hobaugh, who was the captain on board the Wood Rush during that, that would be, kind of his swan song. And the truth is, no. He went to Duluth and was actually in charge of the sector there. And when the Mesquite ran aground, another cutter that looked just like this one, ran aground off of Keweenaw, he was involved in sinking it for divers. And I've dove that wreck. It's a fantastic wreck. And luckily, nobody was killed when it ran aground. They pulled the buoy off where the rock was, and they backed onto the rock. It's like not a good thing, but the wreck is down there now, and it's salvaged because of Jimmy. And he also became the director at the Valley Camp Museum, where the lifeboats were. So what an amazing treat for people who came to the lifeboats and saw them. And then Jimmy was standing there talking about why the buoy was crushed from the attempt that they made to mark the wreck. And I thought, well, that's probably it. Once Jimmy passed away, maybe his legacy would be over with. But the truth is, it wasn't, because Jimmy's son was an astronaut. And Scorch Hobaugh, which I don't know why they called him Scorch, except that he had crashed an airplane before, and Jimmy would not tell me why. But 3 missions on the shuttle, what an amazing family, and what a legacy to have on board. And that's pretty much, I thought, the end of the story, until all of a sudden I found out that Gordo, when he came to Saginaw, sang the song funny. Instead of saying at 7 p.m. a main hatchway gave in, and the cook came out and said, "Fellas, it's been good to know you," he basically changed it to, at 7 p.m. it grew dark and then. And I'm like, why would he do that? And the truth was that a Canadian documentary came out, and it basically said that they did some computer simulations, and there's no way the hatches gave loose. And I went to Sandusky and gave a lecture and was talking, and out comes the producer of that, Mike Fletcher, and starts telling the audience about, well, yeah, the hatches didn't do this. And I went, whoa, 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 whoa. So I went back up on stage afterwards, because I was emceeing it, and I said, I saw hatches 1 and 2. I hit it with a submarine. They're collapsed in. The main hatchway, there's not a main hatchway. There's 22 of them. But many of them did collapse in. That's part of the story. And Gordon had changed it because he thought the family members would feel better about his song. The truth is, nobody liked this song when it first came out. Those family members did not want to hear about the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. When I sailed on board the Wolverine, which is now called the Robert Pearson, the Wolverine, we went out November 10th, and I told the mate, it was an Oglebay Norton ship. I said, "Did you ever have anything to do with the Fitz?" He goes, "Yeah, I was the 3rd mate on board there." And I said, "Well, what do you think about it? And he goes, well, I hate that song, right away. And it's because it reminds you of them. Well, now Gordon goes to the museum. He's met a lot of the family members. He's signed things for them and stuff. And there's so much of a better rapport. And I think they truly understand where his heart is on that. And I hope that that's what people will understand about me, that I've done 150 shipwreck dives, and 99% of those shipwreck stories from the 1940 storm, I'm the only guy to have interviewed 2 of the survivors from the Nova Dock. In 1913, I interviewed a wheelsman who was 18 years old that survived the 1913 storm. All of those family members love the stories and want to hear more. There's just 2 families on the Fitzgerald that were constantly upset about anything that we did because we found the crew member that was missing. My heart goes out to them. I understand that kind of loss, not from a sailor, but from other things that have happened in my family. But I do get that the attention is a problem. But I also understand, too, that every November they run out and they do interviews with them. And it's kind of become, almost, God, I hate to say it, almost like a celebrity status for them. I could never imagine the grief that they go through. But they get a vocal voice box that goes to these audiences that people hear this stuff. And I think they hold a lot of weight because they lost a loved one on board there. And sadly, it changed the song, which I think is ridiculous. The other thing I didn't like was when they dove the Fitzgerald to get the bell, Bruce in the suit went down, and one of the ladies whose dad was on board as one of the, I think, wheelmen, said, my dad would really like to have a beer. And they brought an old Milwaukee beer can and they dropped it into the pilot house with the newt suit. And I thought, this is such a bad idea. I mean, for archaeology, from 100 years now, we have shipwrecks that are 300 years old in the Great Lakes. And they'll probably be there for another 1,000 years. We've got trees that we see from after the massive glaciers left 5,000 years ago, and they still look like trees. So we know these shipwrecks will be there, and that story will be there. And I hope to heck that somebody doesn't go in there and say, we know why it sank. The captain was drunk. He was drinking Old Milwaukee. So to me, I understand why they did it. Again, my heart goes out. But there's got to be a limit to saying, what input they can have. And even closing down the wreck right now, to me, they basically have a structure in place that you have to have a license to dive the Fitzgerald or the 2 where the divers were lost with Cousteau, the Hamilton and the Scourge. Those are the only 3 wrecks in Canada that you need permission to go and dive and to explore. You can't without paperwork. And the wreck is not off limits. It's just very difficult to get permission. I guarantee you, if Jean-Michel Cousteau wants to go dive it, or Bob Ballard comes to the Great Lakes again and says, I'd like to go see it, I bet you they'll get permission to do it. I think that's what it's open to. Will we, as private citizens, go there again? Never. It's not going to happen again. Maybe in another 100 years. But those clues are still down there, and I'm still, now with 25 years of research, I want to know more. I have to know more about what's going on there. And they even had a massive, huge sonar survey that was done on there. I think I have a picture of it. Let me see. Yeah. Look at this. This was just afterwards. The Canadian government said, okay, no more dives. You can't make any dives. And Whitefish came out with brand new technology and sonar and went across the top of it and said, we're not diving. This is a towfish. We're just cruising across. Immediately the Canadian government, the ministry said no more sonar either. The families were upset that they did it. But look at the hatches. There's no clear indication of any of those hatches all the way on this forward section. I think this is an anomaly. I don't believe that this is correct because out of 150 shipwrecks, I've seen probably 4 big steel wrecks. I've never seen a spar deck collapse like this to where there would be nothing there. I think it's a shadow. We see good definition in the Texas and the pilot house right here. We see even the steering pole going up, but this just doesn't look right to me. But we won't know. We won't know because we can't go back. And so a lot of us are just chomping at the bit to try to see what we'll find there. How about some questions? Does anybody have any questions about Edmund Fitzgerald? Yes.
That captain who decided to go and storm with
Yep.
Did he have some kind of deadline?
No, I mean, it's bravado. Yes. The question was, did he have a death wish? I mean, did he have a deadline? Oh, yeah. Did he have a deadline? Yeah, the deadline, yes. In 1913, when the ships went out, the shipping companies gave them bonuses to go in. That was all but abolished by the time, you know, modern shipwrecks came out. It's always been the captain's discretion on whether or not he should go. And there's been all kinds of nonsense written about shipwrecks like the Cedarville that was involved in a collision where the author of the book just lambastes saying the shipping company forced them to do that. That's not true. They've got so much money wrapped up into the training and the ship and these guys that they're not going to push them to run one more cargo. It wouldn't have made any major difference for them. So what was it? It comes down to bravado. It comes down to a captain that says, I can beat that storm. And it's the decisions that are made on almost every shipwreck that I've gone to visit where they just made a bad call. And sometimes in 1913, the barometer goes down, they all waited, and then the barometer goes back up, and they said, oh, we're okay, but there was a second storm behind it. And they got caught out there with, you know, no help. They knew what was happening on this ship. And I hate to be so hypercritical, but the truth is there were a lot of ships that hid out from that. And we still see it with our 1,000-footers today, that they're not going to go out there and risk that on the storm because it's not worth it anymore. We don't have as many freighters out there. They make less trips. And when the big waves come up, and we just had some, you saw the big waves come up on the Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. They were coming right over the top of the pier. Most of those ships all went to anchor. So literally it wasn't, you know, it's just a bad call that happened on there, unfortunately. Yes, ma'am.
What was the name of the light that wasn't on?
Whitefish Point. Yep.
There's a man named Raymond Ramsey.
Yeah, fantastic architect, yeah.
Naval architect for the building and the engineering done on Fitzgerald.
Absolutely.
In 2 books now, he claims that the actual calculation of the keel, the engineering calculation, was not done.
Yeah.
It was done by rule of thumb. They merely looked at a smaller ship, 600, and extrapolated figures.
Yeah.
His contention is that it broke up on the surface because the keel failed.
And that's I mean, to me, knowing what happened, you know, from what I saw on the bottom, it definitely broke up somewhere, either surface or mid-column. It didn't go all the way down in one piece. Ramsey, a lot of the stuff that he came back up with, the design stuff that was issues, I think had some validity to it. Red Bergner, the cook that was on board too, told us a story about how his job at Fraser Shipyard was to winter the ship. Remember, if you park a ship in the winter, you've got to keep the steam up or everything will freeze. And his job was to stay on board as a caretaker of the ship and keep that steam up. Well, he would watch as they put the bow thrusters in, this propeller system in the front of the ship that allowed them to go into the river systems a lot more effectively. And when he went underneath, he heard the guys talking that the keel was actually loose, that it was breaking loose, and they went and put a bunch of junk in there and welded over the top of it. And he said the Coast Guard just basically said, hey, no, that's not possible. We don't believe it. Now we're starting to hear more from the shipyard that that's a possibility. A lot of guys don't talk about it because they know that their pensions kind of ride in the balance to have that. So I think now as they're getting older, we're hearing a lot more stories. The problem is that those stories get tainted as more people talk about it, and we don't know what to believe anymore. So it's really tough to qualify that. But Ramsey obviously is one of the builders of the ship and designers of it. You got to put some validity to it.
He said there was so much pressure to get the ship designed in service that they took shortcuts in the engineering.
And the only thing I would throw against that is the fact that the Jackson still sails. I mean, they're obviously not taking her out into huge, 30-foot waves, but the truth is she's been on the lakes for all this time and they haven't had any issues with it that we know of. So you've got to kind of hold that in context a little bit. I don't think there was any major design differences because it was only a year apart from when the Jackson came out. But, yeah, I've got to at least say, that this one's still sailing today. Yes?
I've sailed on the Jackson for the last 2 years. We do the summer clamps. It's pad eyes, centers, and pad eyes.
Yep.
And that's the same thing. You do that until November 1st.
Yep.
And then it's a big stigma about that. So it's all clamps.
I'll bet. That's not a fun job, is it?
On winter gear.
Oh, my God.
About 2.5 hours before we make a dock. And then you spend another 2-3 hours putting everything up.
Wow. That's incredible.
By the time you're done, you have all your winter gear off.
Amazing. That would be a hard job. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Is Whitefish Point known for a lot of shipwrecks?
It is.
Because of the weather conditions?
They call it the shipwreck coast, and that's largely because it's out in the middle of nowhere. The only harbor of refuge really they have is a tiny breakwall up by Grand Marais, and then you get the Whitefish Bay where it looks like a shark fin on Michigan, and it can get behind there. So if you're caught out there, it's a real problem. They had life-saving stations, at least 3 of them at Two Hearted and across the way, so they knew that those were areas that were really dangerous. Was it the worst place on the Great Lakes? No. We had actually more collisions and more groundings at the tip of the thumb. If you go to Point Au Bark, that reef system that's out there snagged all kinds of ships, but there aren't many left because they literally just went through and picked them up and salvaged them because they were all in relatively shallow water. If you go to Alpena, there's shipping lines that went through there, and there's all kinds of collisions off of Alpena, and that's why NOAA has that fantastic museum there. Has anybody been to the museum there? Again, another promise to me, go to the NOAA facility in Alpena, and you can walk on a schooner that's sinking and actually go down to a shipwreck as you're walking down the deck. It's pretty amazing, and it's the repository for all of the artifacts that have been taken off the bottom. We now have a better feeling about not taking things off the bottom. Part of that is because we can buy GoPros for $200 now, little cameras, and go down and show everybody what we see. But back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was commonplace to go out there and steal pieces of the wreck to bring it up and go, look what I've got. And then it would end up in somebody's garage and turn into dust. Underwater, perfectly preserved. If you bring it up, it dries out and crumbles if you don't preserve it. So there's all kinds of pieces of wrecks that are now in people's yards. If you go up through Minnesota, all the yards have anchors and stuff. They brought up a big rudder from the Mataafa, which was lost in 1905. They brought it up, and as soon as they brought it up, it started to rust. And they said, well, who's going to pay for it? And nobody had any money, so they just put it back down under the water. I mean, what are you going to do with it? So we don't take those things anymore, and what I try to teach people is, you know, my kids are divers now. All 3 of my kids are divers. My little grandbaby, her first Halloween costume was a pop bottle painted like a scuba tank. So I'm hoping that Hannah is going to be a diver, and the truth is, I'm sure with the pressure of her daddy and her grandpa, it's going to happen. But I want them to see the things that I see on the bottom, and it's terrible to know they were gone. In the very back, sir?
What's the exact date of the accident when it happened?
When the accident happened, November 10th, 1975. Yep, it's 7 o'clock, I think 7:10 is the last time they looked at the radar, and it was over in minutes. And that November, I mean, that's the big date with big storms on the Great Lakes. That's why we talk about the gales, 1940, 126-mile-an-hour winds. So another lecture for you. How's that pitch, huh? Yes, sir.
What was the name of that book again that you mentioned about the mention of not Lake Superior not giving up for that?
Oh, Having Hearst's book called Long Ships Passing. Yep. And it should be, I'm hoping it's here, and if not, it's definitely at University of Michigan or any of the older ones too. Maybe time for 2 more questions? Yes.
The owner, you said there was a collision. Was there a lot of life?
No, thank heavens. But the weird thing is when it hit bow on, and the dent that it made in the pilot house looks exactly like the dent on the Edmund Fitzgerald. People had talked to me when they saw the collision because the very front of the pilot house is dented in by almost 4 feet. And they thought, oh, no, that's the water pressure that hit that. And it might have been, but looking at the Homer, with that pressure of it hitting, it could have been from hitting the bottom of Lake Superior. And that's why we have that giant dent in there. I would definitely, if you look behind it, the Texas deck is folded like an S. It's supposed to be straight. The deck is folded like this from that weight when it hit and that momentum when it hit. The stress was intense, and the rest of the ship, you know, the anchor actually fell through. You can see where it went through the pocket and just tore up the whole bow. It had to have been catastrophic, and it was over in seconds, really. So I don't think we can really fully understand what those last moments must have been like. Yes, sir.
Do they have any good sonar pictures of the bottom of the marks that the ship made when it hit?
Yeah, some people have talked to where it skidded in, and this new sonar that they had such better resolution. That's what we were hoping to get some pictures of. Unfortunately, most of the tours that go down there are what I call glamour tours. That sounds horrible because this is a gravesite, don't get me wrong. 29 guys lost their lives in an instant. But the truth is, when we went down, it was just to get pictures of the pilot house and some upside down stuff. If I'd known what I knew now, I would have done a better dive into it. I think with the sonar too, they get one wide piece, and they're really not looking for anything specific. the hope is now with the new technology and the price of that technology coming down that we'd be able to do something really, bring together some real experts on what to look for. Go find that hatch or the tank top, the mushroom cap on the vent and see. Absolutely. I never went through the debris field. There was nothing for me to capture on the camera, but think of all the things that I could have seen. And I don't know that they did that when they brought up the bell, which would have been that first high-definition scan that they did of the ship, too. Yeah, ma'am.
Widows, did they actually receive something? And
yes.
They did. Yeah.
They did. The command crew would get the majority, and then as you went down in rank, less money would come in, but they all did. Most of them didn't talk about what the actual settlement was, but yeah, nothing could make up for the loss, obviously, but some kind of, a pittance. Absolutely wouldn't change. It becomes the mystery. Why do people climb mountains? For me, could it help maybe in another investigation? I think we might be fooling ourselves into thinking that, it would somehow bring up something we do differently. What we really need to do is talk to the captains and say, don't go out there. This is what we don't do. Even if the Fitzgerald was the 1,000-footer, I think Mother Nature could still sink a 1,000-footer. We see it. We see them get grounded all the time. So accidents will continue to happen. We continually lose sailboats on the lakes, tugboats. We just lost a tugboat that was involved with the Montrose collision. Remember that big freighter that collided off of the Ambassador Bridge in the 62, something like that? That little tugboat just sank off of Sheboygan not too long ago. So it's still happening today, and it for various reasons, but mostly because people don't respect the lakes. One more, and then I better let you guys go. It's been a long night.
If it's forbidden or just verboten to go to a shipwreck and basically touch and alter it, why was it acceptable to bring the bell up?
That's a good question. Why was it acceptable if it's, verboten or forbidden to bring things up from the wreck? Why was it okay to bring that up? The first was because the family members said it was okay. When they said, we want to have a memorial, we want to have a church, a place to bring it, and there was many of us who were involved in it. And again, who am I? I'm just a documentary guy, but my voice was, bring it to Mariners Church in Detroit. That's where the first bell chimed for them. That's where, you could go, but I'm glad they brought it to Whitefish Point. I mean, all they have up there is snowmobiling and hunting, and people go up there and pay money to see it, and it's a fantastic museum. It educates people on not just the Fitzgerald, but all of the Great Lakes and the lifesavers and the amazing history that we've had, 300 years of sailing on the Great Lakes. So I think it's important, but it could have went to the church there, and I think that's why it came up, was the family said, this would be a memorial for my lost loved one, but then nobody goes back. And I get that, I understand it, but again, knowing my body of work, there's 30 DVDs that I put on PBS. I donate them for free to PBS so that they can share this history with people. I put them on videos and sell them for $15 so I can put air in my scuba tanks so that, when I go out, I just got back 3 weeks ago from Manitoulin Island chasing one of the Christmas tree ships, the ships that used to deliver the Christmas trees, the Ruth Simmons being the most famous Christmas tree ship that sank in Lake Michigan. Well, one that was docked next to her was called the Knee, and the Knee was actually sunk up off of an island up there. And here's how I found it. Now, this is my last story, I swear. I went up there and looked for it. My wife, Sheila, who's in the back, went out with her girlfriends to Traverse City area, and she goes, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to go look for a shipwreck. So I went on Google Earth, and I looked at Manitoulin Island, the largest island in the Great Lakes. It's all the way at the very top of Lake Huron. I packed our Traverse full of a sleeping bag and some beef jerky sticks and some water and my scuba gear, and I drove all the way up there. When I got to customs, I pull out my ID, my passport, and it was expired at the Sioux. And I looked at the guy and I said, you're not going to believe this. He goes, well, why do you keep your old passport? And I said, because my wife and I went on our honeymoon on this. It means a lot to me. And he's like, okay, a little tear. He let me go through. I get to Manitoulin Island. It's getting dark and there's no place to stay. So I sleep in the Traverse. I thought I parked into an area that it was, I thought it was one of those park and saves, where you can park and carpool. I woke up, it was a used car lot. So right across the street from the police station at Julia Bay, and I'm like, oh my God, I could have gotten arrested there. But I started looking at these shipwrecks, and I could not find the Skeel, this old ship that was called the Knee that went down in a big storm. And I have all the photographs from an audience member that brought them to all the journey from Chicago, past the Grand Hotel, all the way into Barry Island where it sank. And I thought, how am I going to find this? There's cliffs there. I couldn't get near it. I went to the airport. They said they'd never seen a schooner up there. I said, well, it's got to be up here. So I made a video on YouTube, and I put all the shipwrecks on there. I put some pictures on there, and I said, hopefully someone will tell me about it. 3 years later, 7,000 hits on the video, and someone called me and said, it's at my deer camp. And so I said, when can I come see you? And it was 3 weeks ago, and my son and I hopped in the car, rode all the way up there, and we found debris for a half a mile of schooner pieces everywhere. So we're super excited. We didn't find the bulk of the wreck. I found part of the keel, but it's another story that you're just going to have to come back and see me here at the library to talk about. I appreciate you coming on. I'm sorry I kept you long. Please come see us back here and get some videos and support this amazing library.